Okay, so welcome everyone. So happy to be learning with you again today. Today's class, again, is the Poetics of Mishnah, a methodological approach with Rabbi Dr. Avi Walfish and Rabbanit Dr. Adina Sternberg. This class is part of Drisha's ongoing Mishnah project dedicated to the memory of a great lover and student of Mishnah, Rivka Rosenwein, Zichronah Livracha. Just a quick word just on how we'll run the class. So I'm sending invitations to everyone to be promoted to a panelist. If you do get that invitation, you might want to accept it because that gives you the opportunity to be able to unmute during class and ask questions and make comments. If you do during the class when Rabbi Walfish is teaching, just keep yourself muted so and just unmute whenever you need to ask questions so we can all hear everything and hear each other. You can engage in the class by asking questions or making comments here at the chat box on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook if you're watching us there live. As a reminder, this class is being taught by Rabbi Walfish and Rabbanit Sternberg. They will alternate weeks and topics. This week, our instructor is again Rabbi Walfish. I believe next week will be Rabbanit Sternberg. And with that, I'll turn this to Rabbi Walfish.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, last week we had a brief introduction to what and why is Mishnah. The why we still have to investigate. The short answer is that following the destruction of the temple, there was a need to solidify Torah Sheba'al Peh. But why it took the precise form that it took in Mishnah is still a big question. We talked somewhat about the stages towards the end of the Second Temple period. Okay, probably when there was a realization that the Second Temple would not last that much longer. That's when the codification process began, taking laws that had been transmitted in a very fluid and dynamic form, no fixed formulations, no fixed order, began to be formulated and arranged. And we have one or two tractates of the Mishnah that probably date from that period, Masechtot about temple service, like Tamid and Midot. Immediately following the destruction, we have Masechet Eduyot from the Yavne period, which is right after the destruction. And we have the testimony of the Tosefta, a companion volume to the Mishnah, that this happened because of a fear that oral law would be forgotten. And so they decided that they had to put it together, bring it together. And that ended up morphing into Masechet Eduyot, began then, moved into higher gear at the time of Rabbi Akiva, let's say one generation later. And Rabbi Akiva's disciples are the ones who are largely responsible for all of the Tannaitic, or most, I should say. One of Rabbi Akiva's contemporaries, Rabbi Yishmael, is responsible for some of the Midrashic works. His disciples were the redactors of some of the Midrashic works, what we call Midrash Halacha, Halachic Midrashim, so-called, okay, not the most accurate term, but that's how it's known. But Rabbi Akiva's disciples were responsible not only for many of the Halachic Midrashim, but also for the Mishnah and ultimately, shortly after the Mishnah, the Tosefta. So we looked a bit at some of the sources that when you put them together, they give you a picture of how these stages unfolded. And what we closed with last class is, what did Rabbi do with his sources? Rabbi had a lot of sources. Many of these sources did not actually make it into the Mishnah. The ones that didn't are called baraitot, from the Aramaic word bar, which means outside. Okay, outside, external Mishnayot, not included in the canonical Mishnah. But many of those baraitot were collected 1 or 2 generations later, either in the form of Tosefta, which, as I mentioned, is a companion volume to the Mishnah, compiled within 1 to 2 generations after the Mishnah itself, and it was designed to accompany the Mishnah. Although we noted already last time that many of the materials in the Tosefta actually precede the materials in the Mishnah, okay, but the work itself was edited after the Mishnah. The halachic midrashim, which I've already mentioned, is another collection of baraitot. Those also were redacted about 1 to 2 generations after the redaction of the Mishnah. As I say, they very often preserve the materials, the building blocks from which Rabbi composed the Mishnah. Okay, so now the question is, what we saw many question marks about how the Mishnah is redacted. That's how we opened the class. We came back to this somewhat later, that the way the Mishnah is constructed is very, very often surprising. In fact, I would dare say it's more often surprising than it is readily or easily understandable.
Would you like me to read? Oh.
Okay. Yeah, I was just doing something on my screen.
Yeah, that's okay. There's actually also a quick question in the chat. Could I read it to you real quick, or did you already see it?
No, I'm trying.
Yeah, let me read this to you. I just want to make sure. Somebody was asking, is this going to become a PowerPoint, or should I take notes? Also, is there a Hebrew book with only the Rambam and Mishnayot?
A Hebrew book, yes, there is a Hebrew book with only Rambam on Mishnayot. The main one is the Kapach edition of the Rambam's Mishnah commentary. Then there are individual volumes of the Rambam's commentary that have been published, in various other formats. Yeshivat Ma'ale Adumim is responsible for several of those. There won't be a PowerPoint, but there will be a PDF file, the same one that was included in the chat. That same PDF file will okay.
Yeah, I will put it. I will put the new one. I just saw that there was another one, so I will put it in the chat right now.
Okay, and I'll be putting it up on share screen shortly, and anyone who wants, you have it in the chat, so you can access it on your computer directly, not only through the share screen.
Will we have a chance to ask a question?
Yes.
Will we have a chance? Because I have a couple of questions in my mind. Will I have a chance to ask them?
Would you like to ask them? Is this a good time, Rabbi Walfish, for a couple questions, or would you like to wait for another time?
Now is fine.
Okay, perfect.
So I wanted to ask you, since we assume that Rabbi was the editor of the Mishnah, to whom is the edition of the Tosefta attributed? This is number one. And number two, do we have a Babylonian equivalent to the Mishnah, and if not, why? And this is for now.
Okay, so the short answer to question number one is we don't know. We have many sources that indicate that Rabbi was the redactor of the Mishnah. It's a tradition that goes back to the earliest Talmudic times. So it's pretty clear that Rabbi was the redactor of the Mishnah, even though it's not stated explicitly in any Tannaitic source. It comes up in the Talmud, but there are enough preponderance of sources that make that clear. Tosefta, we don't really know. We know that Rabbi's leading disciple, Rabbi Chia, was very much involved in redacting and collecting and redacting Baraita. Is that our Tosefta? Is a serious question. Some scholars think yes, some scholars think no. If it wasn't Rabbi Chia, it was probably Rabbi Chia's cousin, because we have some internal indications from the Tosefta. It was redacted around the time of Rabbi Chia, maybe completed a generation after. So it's possible that he was the redactor. If not, it was most likely somebody from his generation. As far as Babylonian equivalents, the main Babylonian Talmudic source we have, virtually the only one we have, is the Babylonian Talmud. We don't have any equivalent to Mishnah. We don't have any equivalent to Tosefta. We don't have any equivalent to the Tannaitic Midrashim. We don't have any equivalent to the Amoraic Midrashim later on. One of the suggestions as to why that is, well, why they don't have Tannaitic materials is probably because at the time of Tanaim, the center was clearly in Eretz Yisrael. And we don't know seems to have been much weaker Talmudic knowledge and scholarship in Bavel at the time. In the Amoraic period, there's more parity, but it seems that the Babylonians put all of their energies into composing the Talmud, and whatever might have gone into some other work, they just incorporated into the Babylonian Talmud. As opposed to Eretz Yisrael, where along with composing their own Talmud, the Yerushalmi, they also composed other works. Okay, let's get back to our swing of things. So the Mishnah's redaction raises a lot of question marks. The Mishnah generally does not start a topic at the beginning, and there are many leaps and twists and turns and detours and diverging from the path that go on in the Mishnah. So it's really very challenging to get a handle on how it was composed and why it was composed in that way. So now, today we're going to study a chapter of Mishnah. Okay, chapters of Mishnah, very generally speaking, can be understood as forming complete units. Okay, very often complete thought units, and generally speaking, complete literary units. We're going to look at a chapter, and it's a chapter that is often discussed in discussions of how Mishnah came to be composed and what is the nature of Mishnaic composition. Let's get it up on our screen. Okay, I hope you've all had an opportunity to look at it. Okay, and get a basic overview. Okay, I'm not gonna, at this juncture, I'm not gonna read all the Hebrew. I'm not even gonna read all the English. Okay, but we'll sort of scroll down through the chapter and try to get a sense of where it's going and how it's constructed. And then after doing that, we'll also get a sense as to why this chapter has played such a central role in discussions of what Mishnah is all about. So it opens with a woman is acquired in 3 ways and acquires herself in 2 ways. We are not, at least at this juncture, going to get into this notion of acquisition. The Hebrew for that is kinyan, niknate. Obviously, that's a hot button issue, especially in today's climate, and we will have something to say about it as we go along. but we're going to do it textually, okay? In other words, we're not getting here into ideology. Clearly, there are some gaps between the perceptions of the ancient world, and there's no question we're dealing with a patriarchal society. How patriarchal, how seriously to take these concepts, okay, is again not our topic. And I really like very much to try to make this textual so we can see how Mishnah works, and leave the ideological side of things for other occasions. Okay, but again, some of the ideas we'll be discussing, I think, will be useful in those discussions when we conduct them, which is not now. Okay, one thing though I think is crucially important to say right from the outset, and that is acquisition does not translate into property. Okay, there is no statement here that the wife is the property of her husband, and all you have to do is note that she acquires herself not exactly in the same ways in which she is acquired. She is acquired through money, contract, sexual intercourse, okay? And she acquires herself through a get or through the death of her husband. She does not acquire herself, obviously, through sexual intercourse, okay? Or like, I don't know how you would undo sexual intercourse, but there's no equivalent to that. And there's also no equivalent to money. You think if he gives her money to acquire her, maybe she should give him money to acquire stuff. That doesn't happen. So the asymmetry is already an indication. We're not talking about property, okay? A husband cannot sell his wife, okay? And it goes without saying, he can't do with her as he pleases. His acquiring her means he has certain rights, okay? In other words, she has certain obligation towards him. Her obligations towards him are like rights that he has in her. And there are many authorities who argue that she also has rights in her husband, even though there's no statement ever that the wife acquires the husband in any shape, manner, or form. But in his acquisition, quote unquote, of the wife, he also assumes certain obligations towards her. Okay, so we should just understand, again, without getting more deeply into this, that the term acquisition, we have to sort of neutralize it to an extent, maybe not entirely. The term is still there, it still means something, okay, and it's still something that we have difficulty relating to, but it's not nearly as bad as it sounds, because we're not talking about acquiring the sense of property. We're talking about a broader sense of acquisition, the sense of acquisition creating certain kinds of relationships, certain kinds of obligations and rights. That's what the term acquisition means. And we'll very shortly see that the Mishnah itself clearly indicates that this term, kinyan, acquisition, has a range of meanings. Okay? So that's how we open. Aisha niknei b'shlosha drachim. We then continue with a levirate wife. Okay, I'm jumping down in the English to the next to last line. A levirate wife is acquired through sexual intercourse, that and that alone, and acquires herself either through the chalitza, shoe removal, or through the death of the levirate husband, the avam. We jump from there in Mishnah Bet to a Hebrew slave is acquired through money or a contract and acquires himself through years. In other words, he's completed the requisite number of years for an Evet Ivri, okay, or through a jubilee year, or through prorated money. In other words, unlike a wife who cannot reacquire herself through money, an Evet Ivri can. Money was paid to acquire him, he pays money to release himself from that situation. And a Hebrew maidservant additionally acquires herself through signs of puberty. A pierced slave, Evet Nirtzah, is acquired by piercing and acquires himself by jubilee or the master's death. Okay, now we move down to Eved Knani, a Canaanite slave. It's acquired with money, a contract, or establishment of possession. That's not right off the bat. Will become important later. This is the first example after a woman of someone who's acquired in three ways. And two of them are identical to the way that a wife is acquired. Okay, money and contract are identical, but the third one is not. There's already, again, a difference between property, a Canaanite slave, and again, slavery is, again, a hot button issue. Okay, let's just accept that it exists, okay, and that a slave is defined halachically as property. So, establishment of possession, the Hebrew for that is chazakah, which will become a key term as we go through this chapter. So, he is acquired through chazakah, a wife is not. She is acquired through intercourse. Okay, and the difference between intercourse and chazakah is exactly the difference between marital, quote unquote, acquisition and property, real acquisition. Okay, and acquires himself with money by others or a contract by himself. Now let's note, when we say money by others, that seems to indicate that the Eved Knani, while he can acquire himself through money, same way he was acquired through money, he became property. By paying money, he can now release himself because he reacquires himself. However, he needs the intervention of somebody else, by others. Why? Because property can't acquire itself. Okay, in order to acquire himself, he needs some other legal personality who is not property, who is not an Eved, who can pay the money and use that to acquire him. Okay, but if the master writes him a contract, a bill of release, okay, a star shichrur, or get shichrur, then he can receive it on his own. He doesn't need anybody else's intervention to be released. That's according to Rabbi Meir. The sages say the opposite. They say money, there is some kind of way in which the Eved can release himself by paying money without the intervention of somebody else. But as far as the contract is concerned, for that he needs somebody to release him. Okay? In other words, if the master wants to release him by giving a contract, he has to give the contract to a third party on behalf of the Eved, and he can't give it directly to the Eved himself. Okay? I dwelt on that a bit because, as we'll see, this plays an important structural role in the chapter. Okay? A large animal is acquired through transfer of the reins and a small animal through lifting. Okay? Property which is lienable, yesh lan achrayut. Okay? In other words, it can have a lien imposed upon it. That means real property. Okay? Land. Okay? That can be acquired through money, a contract, or possession. Again, let's note, this is identical to what we said about the Eved Knani, money, contract, or possession. Identical to that and similar, though not identical, to how a wife is acquired. And that which is not lienable is acquired only through pulling it. That's the Hebrew for that is meshicha, kinyan meshicha. Okay? So that's how movable property. What's not lienable means movable property. That's how that is acquired. Okay, then Mishnah Vav, anything which acts as currency for something else, once this one comes into possession, he is obligated for its exchange. Okay, that's called often in halacha kinyan chalipin, barter, transfer. Okay. So you have property that can be translated into monetary terms. Basically, what we're talking about is movable property. Any kind of movable property can be bartered for other movable property. And the meaning of that is that once one of the parties acquires the property that he is contracting to acquire, he is automatically obligated to give the other party, okay, the exchange. Okay, in other words, he can't back out of it anymore. Okay, in other words, the exchange has gone through and the property has been acquired. So I took my property physically into my possession. The other one has now acquired the property that was originally mine, even though he has not yet taken it into his possession. But it's worth noting that the Mishnah formulated it differently. Didn't say that B acquired the property. It said A is obligated to transfer the property. Okay, that difference, as we'll see, can be highly significant. Okay, then the Mishnah says the high authority acquires by money, and the lay authority, okay, in other words, secular, anybody who's contracting a secular transaction, acquires by possession. That's again the word chazakah that we have encountered earlier in the chapter. Okay, and amirati legavoa kimsirati lehedyo. Speech to the high authority is like transfer, misirati, transfer to the lay authority. Okay, so far the whole chapter has been talking about different forms of acquisition, right? And we're wondering, what does any of this have to do with Tractate Kiddushin? I thought Tractate Kiddushin was about marriage. So of all this discussion, how much so far of the chapter has been about marriage? Exactly one Mishnah, or even, okay, one part of one Mishnah. Because the second part of that Mishnah talked about levirate marriage. It's not exactly the same thing. Marriage per se is the first part of the first Mishnah. And then we just get into, while we're on the subject, so this gets acquired this way, that gets acquired that way, and we have a whole list of how different things get to be acquired. Why? Why are we doing it? Okay, Mishnah Zayin. Okay, Mishnah Zayin. All commandments of the son upon the father, men are obligated and women are exempt. All commandments of the father upon the son, both men and women are obligated. What just happened now? Where are we gone? Where's the Mishnah taking us now? Okay, we have commandments of the son upon the father. Okay, maybe that has something to do with the family. That's not marriage. That has to do with relationships within a family. It's not the subject of this tractate. There are other tractates that talk about relationships within the family. For example, Daf Yomi recently ended Masechet Ketubot, which has a lot to say about relationships within the family. But what does this have to do with Tractate Kiddushin? Doesn't seem to have anything to do with the overall subject of the tractate, and even less to do with the first part of the chapter. It was all about acquisitions. And now the very famous Mishnah, well, you're all aware of this, I'm sure. Every positive time-bound commandment, men are obligated and women are exempt. Every positive non-time-bound commandment, both men and women are obligated. Every negative commandment, whether time-bound or not, both men and women are obligated. Looking at the next Mishnah, leanings, wavings, presentations, fistfuls, all of these are sacrificial procedures. They're procedures that are carried out upon different aspects of the temple service, and all of these apply to men but do not apply to women. Okay? Men can perform all of these things, women cannot. Well, any thoughts about what these two latest Mishnayot are about, 7 and 8?
Who
What's their common theme?
Who's obligated, who's not, time-bound, non-time-bound. More time for the
Okay, good. Let's focus it just one further detail. Talking about which
difference-
commandments apply to whom, and the focus is on
The difference
You say
between
who-
men and
who-
women, no?
men versus women.
Mhm.
The basic question is which mitzvot apply only to men and which mitzvot apply also to women. That's the subject here.
Mhm.
We've moved in a completely new direction and we're really scratching our heads as to what this is doing in Tractate Kiddushin,
Mhm.
and certainly in this chapter. Now, Mishnah 9, any non-land related commandment applies inside and outside the land of Israel. And any land-related commandment, which is tied to the land, applies only in the land. Okay, now we've moved from not to whom do commandments apply, but now where do commandments apply? Before we were talking about something social, to which social grouping the commandments apply, men versus women. Now we're talking about something geographic, in which geographic region the mitzvot apply. Some mitzvot apply only in the land, other mitzvot apply outside the land as well, and now we conclude the chapter. Okay, anyone who does one commandment, they shower good upon him, lengthen his days, and he inherits the land. Anyone who does not do a single commandment, they do not shower good upon him or lengthen his days, and he does not inherit the land. He has neither scripture, the oral law, or profession is not part of civilization. The Hebrew, eino min hayishuv, ein zeh min hayishuv, not belong to literally the settlement, translated here as civilization. One who seizes all three, hamachzik bishloshtan, okay, and note, by the way, the term hamachzik, that's familiar to us from earlier, but now in a very, very different setting with a different meaning. Okay, one who seizes all three, of him it is said, and the three-ply cord is not quickly severed. Okay, now what's this last Mishnah doing here? How is this last Mishnah connected to anything?
First of all, it adds with the triple, והחוט המשולש, בשלושה דברים.
Okay, that's an interesting observation. It's not the most obvious one. Okay, so you very acutely observed that point that closes the circle with the beginning of the chapter. But let's start off with some of the more apparent connections. Okay, the apparent connections are not to the beginning of the chapter, but to the immediately preceding Mishnah.
Mhm.
Anyone who does one commandment receives all kinds of good things, including inheriting the land.
So
What was the
geographical.
last Mishnah? Which mitzvot apply in the land and which mitzvot apply outside the land as well. Now, we should note right away, this last Mishnah, Mishnah 10, okay, is a classic closing unit in the sense that it is agadic, it's not halachic. It doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what reward you will receive for doing X and what reward you will receive for doing Y. Okay? That's not a halakha. We don't give the rewards. God gives the rewards. And God is not bound to the Mishnah, right? He doesn't need to look at the Mishnah for the Mishnah to tell him what to do. Mishnah is describing how God behaves towards us. Halakha is describing what we are supposed to do towards God. And this Mishnah is talking about how God behaves towards us. So that's agadic, it's not halachic. And very often agadic materials conclude a unit. That's the usual place where the Mishnah will integrate agadic units. Now, why is this particular agadic unit here? So two factors. One of them is commandment. This is the reward for doing a commandment. Even one commandment. Look at all the wonderful reward that the person will receive. And one of the benefits That's part of the reward is to inherit the land. Previous Mishnah talked about when we are in the land, what does that obligate us? And this Mishnah talks about when you perform your obligations, the reward will be that you will inherit the land. So these two Mishnayot are sort of in dialogue with one another. One Mishnah is telling you what the land obligates us to do, and the next Mishnah is talking about how when we perform our obligations, our mitzvot, then the reward will be that God will grant us the land. We will inherit the land. So that's the obvious reason that this is here. Okay, so I think we've seen enough to be really scratching our heads and wondering, what happened to Kiddushin? Where's Kiddushin in all this chapter? One Mishnah about Kiddushin, and then 9 other Mishnayot about everything else under the sun, except for Kiddushin. So what's happening here? Yes, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you. It's just always so stimulating. Is the last Mishnah 10, is it referring to any commandment or is it referring back to the Mishnayot, but right before that, how the conditions for marriage, for the get, or is this any commandment in general?
That is an excellent question. In fact, it's so good that we're not going to deal with it.
Okay, sorry.
It's just too big.
Okay, forget it. Yeah.
What do you mean by this one commandment grants you all of this? Are we talking about a specific commandment that has particular importance? Doesn't sound that way. It sounds like maybe it's a hyperbolic Mishnah that's just telling you, if you do even just one mitzvah, look at what you get for that. And if you fail to do it, look at what you've missed out on. Okay? That's what it sounds like. Okay? But there's a lot of discussion about that, starting with the Tosefta, moving on into the Talmud, from there to the commentaries and down to contemporary scholarship. It's a big, big, big topic. So I've pretty much said all that I think we can say within our framework about that question. So it's definitely worth looking into, but on another occasion.
Question, does Perek Bet start with Kiddushin again?
Perek Bet does start with Kiddushin. In fact, we may notice that one word that is entirely absent from this chapter is Kiddushin. How actually is Kiddushin described? Aisha nikneit. It doesn't use the word Kiddushin. The next chapter starts with Ha'ish mekadesh, v'ha'isha mitkadeshet.
Very good.
And the word lekadesh or lehitkadesh is a key word that runs through that chapter. So that word that is so glaringly absent from our first chapter is the key word of chapter 2, and in fact, it runs through chapter 3 as well. Chapters 2 and 3 are really the main body of Tractate Kiddushin. 4 chapters, Tractate Kiddushin, okay? And chapter 1 seems out of place. Chapter 4 also doesn't actually deal with the topic of Kiddushin. The only chapters of Tractate Kiddushin that actually deal with Kiddushin are the 2 middle chapters, 2 and 3. Okay, so that's where that word appears. Okay, so now I'm not going to start off by directly addressing our question. First, we need a little more text work here. We've already seen that this chapter really divides into 2 main subsections, right? The first subsection is all about what?
Mi nikna, ech nikna.
Ech nikna, right? Not so much me, but ech, okay? It's about how are various types of people and things acquired. The second part of the chapter is all about
מצוות, בדרך כלל,
Oh,
לא?
excellent. It's all about commandments and divisions within the realm of commandments. Which commandments apply only to men and which apply to women as well? Which commandments apply only in the land and which apply outside of the land as well? So now we come to the observation that was first articulated by the earlier generations of Mishnaic scholarship, Talmudic scholarship generally, Mishnaic scholarship particularly, and that is that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi compiled this chapter from two pre-existing collections that originally had nothing to do with tractate Kiddushin. Rabbi simply, yes.
Rabbi Walfish, I just want to double check to see if you saw the question in the chat. What is the significance of the fact that chapter 1 starts with the woman being acted upon and chapter 2 starting with the men acting upon her?
Okay, that's another excellent question. Please, towards the at the end of the class, please remind me of that question. At that juncture, I think we'll be in position to say something about it. At this juncture, I think it's a bit too early to address that. That's also a very important observation. Okay, so now what scholars have noted is that we have basically two collections. Kovets is the Hebrew term for the collection, and the claim of scholars is these are pre-existing collections, and in fact, Yaakov Nachum Epstein, okay, the leading Mishnah scholar of the latter half of the 20th century, okay, argued that these are both very early collections. Okay, contemporary scholars have questioned whether they're quite as early as he thinks they are. Okay, but the idea that these are pre-existing collections is certainly entirely cogent, and they seem to have been composed outside of the framework of tractate Kiddushin. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had two chapters where he wants to address the theme of Kiddushin per se. That's chapters 2 and 3. And as an introduction to those chapters, he cobbled together two other collections. He stitched them together and put them in as his introduction to tractate Kiddushin.
But why did he do so?
What?
What triggered him to take two different sources?
Okay, good. So as far as the first collection is concerned, we have a simple answer to that, and that is the first Mishnah provides us with very important information that is not included in the two main chapters of tractate Kiddushin. First of all, we have the term kinyan, which is a crucial term, very important term, okay, to put on the table. Now, again, Kiddushin as kinyan versus Kiddushin as Kiddushin is another big topic that we won't be able to really address, but by the end of the class, we should have one or two sentences to say about it that will give us a bit of a handle on it. But certainly this perspective was important. And the first Mishnah also told us about the very early dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, about how to define Kesef Kiddushin, how much Kesef is involved in Kesef Kiddushin. Okay, that's an important halachic discussion, and it's also an early halachic discussion. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is pre-destruction of the temple, when the second temple is still standing. Okay, so that's one of the arguments that this, in fact, was an early collection. It's the fact that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are already disputing a prior statement. It said women are acquired through Kesef. Oh, what is Kesef? So they're already discussing an earlier Mishnaic source. So the original Mishnaic source must have been very early, argues Epstein. Okay, so you have, so because the opening of this whole collection dealt with creating a marriage. Actually, we talk about marriage. The better term for this is betrothal. And betrothal, halachically, is stage one of the marriage. It's not just what we call an engagement. Okay, engagement in our parlance is just a commitment to get married. Okay, so sometimes that will be solemnized through a vort or tnaim, there are different terms for it. Okay, you break a plate, you have a little party, you break a plate. Okay, that's formalizing the obligation to get married. That's what we mean by engagement or betrothal. In the halakha, betrothal or engagement means stage one of the marriage. They're already considered to be married. Adultery is already prohibited and punishable by death, but they're not living together yet. And the standard practice was for them to begin living together about a year later, 12 months later. Okay, so I'm going to use, for our purposes, I'll use the terms interchangeably. Okay, but you should be aware of that. Okay,
but
so
you do need a divorce if you change your mind, don't you?
Yes, and you need a divorce in order to back out of it. Correct. Okay, so we have that important information that appears at the beginning of the collection. Now the question is, so why do you have to have the whole rest of the collection? So the standard answer in classic Mishnaic scholarship is, when you have an early collection, and it's already been memorized, so then it's routine. It's like automatic. Okay, if I get up to daven, okay, all I have to do is think about Baruch Atah Hashem, and then my mind can wander to whatever. I can think about the elections, or refrain from thinking about the elections, or think about whatever I like, and automatically I am mouthing the whole rest of Shemona Esrei, right? That's how memory works. Okay, you've memorized something, it becomes part of you. Okay, you can recite it in your sleep. And what happens if I come to somebody and say, no, you got it wrong, change that? Okay, or I say, you know what, after this unit, I don't want you to continue the way you're continuing. I want you to break it up. I want you to put in another unit. What happens? The person gets confused, flustered, the whole thing goes down the tubes. Therefore, once these early collections were committed to memory, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's hands were tied. Okay, he could not treat it like Lego, take it apart and put it back together again the way he wanted to. And therefore, you have this collection that originated in some context where people were describing acquisitions, the laws of acquisitions. There was a tractate called Acquisitions. And this chapter was part of that tractate. Okay, or this first half of the chapter was part of the tractate. And then Rabbi, since he wanted to include part of it in his Kiddushin tractate, he had no choice but to bring the whole thing there, because the people who had memorized it already, okay, once they got into the shvung and said, Aisha nikneit b'shlosha drachim, they just had to continue until they concluded. So where did they conclude? Over here. Nechasim sheyesh lehen achrayut niknim b'chesuf u'b'shtar v'chazaka. Okay? That's where they concluded it. That's where it ended. Okay? Then we had another early tractate all about mitzvot. Now here's where the classic scholarly explanation runs into something of a snag, because it's not really very clear why this has to be in Tractate Kiddushin at all. There are different theories, and I'm not going to bother mentioning them, both because of lack of time and because I don't find any of them at all convincing. Okay, so there are all kinds of theories. Why is that there? But for whatever reason, it was decided that this Kovetz had to be included as well. And this is Kovetz HaMitzvot. Now, okay, the color coding here is supposed to show you how, how the opening formula, okay, there are word repetitions, there are key words that stitch together each of these collections, right? Aisha niknet b'shlosha drachim, Eved Ivri nikneh b'kesef u'bishtar, Eved Knani nikneh, Be'ema gasan niknet, Nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut niknim, She'en lam achrayut einam niknim ela, right? It's all nikneh, nikneh, nikneh. And you have a lot of the same kinyanim repeating themselves. Kesef and shtar run through a lot of these. And then you have bi'ah going into them, and then you have, opposite bi'ah, you have chazakah, okay? I neglected to put it in here in Mishnah Gimel regarding the Eved. You have it here in the Eved, and here you have it regarding nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut, okay? Real property are acquired through kesef, shtar, and chazakah. So you have these key words that run through. Note how in the first part of this collection, you have another phrase that repeats itself. Konet tatzma, konat tatzma, konat tatzma, konat tatzma, konet tatzmo, konet tatzmo, konat tatzma, konet tatzmo, konet tatzmo. That disappears after Mishnah Gimel. Why?
Because we are moving into animals and they don't do anything for
That's
themselves.
right. As long as we're talking about people, with people, how they are acquired and how they acquire themselves are not symmetrical. And they're never sold. A man can't sell his wife, a man can't sell his Eved Ivri or Ama Ivri. I can't sell them. Okay, and so there's nothing symmetrical here.
Right.
He acquires them in some sense, and then they acquire themselves because they're human beings. And that includes, interestingly, the Eved Kna'ani. But the Eved Kna'ani, let's recall, sometimes had to have the intervention of a third party.
Mhm.
So you see how the Mishnah already, in the way it's structured, is indicating that acquisition is a fluid term.
Mhm.
It means one thing when it's applied to human beings, means something else when it's applied to property. And the Eved Kna'ani is smack in the middle.
Mhm.
5 Mishnaic units. The third one in the middle is the Eved Kna'ani. He's in the middle not only numerically, but he's in the middle conceptually as well.
Mhm.
Okay? Now, look at the key words that are running through the mitzvah collection. Kol mitzvah, kol mitzvah, kol mitzvah, kol mitzvah, kol mitzvah. Nashim pturot, nashim chayavin, nashim pturot, nashim chayavin, nashim chayavin. Okay? Okay, and nashim, the first 2 Mishnahs are all about nashim. Then, kol mitzvah. And then, interestingly, kol ha'oseh mitzvah.
Mhm.
Okay? And in the second part, a key word becomes aretz, the land. Okay? So, okay, now you may notice that there's a Mishnah I left out of these 2 collections. First collection goes through Mishnah 5. Second Mishnah collection picks up with Mishnah 7. What happened to Mishnah 6? Let's take a look. Where does Mishnah 6 belong? Kol hana'aseh damim ba'acher. Kevan shezacha zeh nitchayev b'chalipav. What are we talking about? Kinyan or mitzvah? There are no mitzvot here, right? We're talking about a form of kinyan. When I barter, if B physically takes possession of what's being transferred to him, then B is now obligated to transfer his part of the bargain to A. That's talking about transfer of property. That's talking about acquisition, right? And then the second part of the Mishnah talks about Rishut HaGavoa B'Kesef, Rishut HaIdiot B'Chazaka, talking about how does Gavoa, we call it usually Hekdesh, how does the temple treasury acquire things? So the temple acquires things through money, where the layperson will acquire through Chazakah, through taking physical possession. And amirati legavoa k'msirati lehedyot. My verbal statement to hekdesh is like a physical transfer to a layperson. So that's all about acquisition. So does Mishnah 6 belong with the first 5 Mishnayot? Well, in terms of the theme, it does. But what's missing? Why did I put Mishnah 6 apart and not include it with the others? What's missing here?
No mitzvah, no.
It doesn't say
no.
mitzvah. It doesn't say nikneh, right? The
Right.
word nikneh, that's the key word in the whole
Yeah.
first section, is nikneh. It's missing. It's not there.
Yeah.
But it has naaseh instead of oseh.
Now where did the word oseh come up? In which part of the chapter?
The mitzvah.
The first or the second? Now here, let's take a look.
Mhm.
Okay,
Oh, there it is.
here's Mishnah 6.
Right.
Here I'm fitting it into the chapter. What did I do with Mishnah 6? With which collection did I include it?
Both maybe. In between.
Both and neither.
Right.
Okay. Now, I'm going to differentiate here between 2 terms. Here is the first technique of Mishnah redaction we're going to give a name to. Okay. There are going to be several literary techniques employed by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And this week we're encountering the first of them. It's the segue, right? That was in the title of this lecture. No, so nobody asked me why that was the title. Well, here's the answer. 6 is a segue Mishnah, okay? But there are 2 kinds of segue Mishnayot.
What
There's
is
a
segue in Hebrew?
transitional, what?
What is segue in Hebrew?
Segue ma'avar,
Ma'avar. Thank you.
okay?
Oh, yeah.
One form of a segue is a transition, and the second is a bridge. The
Mhm.
transition means it organically belongs to one of the units, but it latches onto the other one. Because you take one unit and you put a hook at the end of that unit to latch on to the next unit. Okay, that we will call a transitional Mishnah. Okay, these are both different forms of segue. One form of segue is a transition,
Mhm.
and that's not what we're encountering here. The kind of segue we're encountering here is a bridge. What do I mean by a bridge? Organically, it doesn't belong to either unit.
Mhm.
Okay?
Mhm.
The themes, the language don't organically belong to either unit. But the theme is closely affiliated with the first part of the chapter. And the language is actually much more closely connected to the second part of the language. Starting with, take a look at the first word of the Mishnah, kol. Kol is a leading word, a key word in the second part of the chapter. In
Mhm.
almost every one of the Mishnahs of the second part of the chapter, you have the word kol. The first Mishnah, you have it many times. In the third Mishnah, you have it several times. In the last, you have it 3 times. It's missing from Mishnah Chet. There's another interesting question. That's also a bridging Mishnah, Mishnah Chet. Okay? Gimel is a transitional Mishnah between the 2 parts of the first collection. Chet is a bridging Mishnah between the 2 parts of the second section. But we're going to focus on the main bridging Mishnah, which is Vav. There's the word kol links it to the second. Na'asa. So we think of, okay, again, look for the green background and blue lettering. Mitzvat aseh, mitzvat aseh, mitzvat lo ta'aseh. Kol ha'oseh mitzvah achat. There's kol ha'na'asa. And most significantly, the word nitchayev. Nitchayev. Look how acquisition is presented in this Mishnah. In the first part of the Mishnah, acquisition meant, okay, I acquire something. It's mine. I have rights in it. I can do with it as I will. Or perhaps a bit more limited. If I'm acquiring a person, then I have limitations on what I can do with it. But within those limitations, I do with it as I will. I have acquired it. That's the language of Mishnah 1 through 5. The language of Mishnah 6 is, when I have acquired my part of the bargain, I am obligated to give him his part. Acquisition is being presented here as an obligation. Obligation is the language of the next section. Chayavim, 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 or pturim, for that matter.
Wait, sorry, chayavin means, what is the actual definition?
Chayavim means obligated.
Obligated, okay,
The
got it.
literal meaning is obligated.
Got it, yeah, sorry.
Now, this last point, I think, is giving us something of, the beginning glimmerings of understanding as to why these two sections are being stitched together. The bridging Mishnah gives you your first indication as to why we're stitching the two of them together. Because the Mishnah wants to indicate, let's take a look. The first part of the chapter is all about the human being's power, particularly power over property and sometimes power over other human beings. The second part of the chapter is all about human beings' obligations. Somebody's power over them. Whose power over them? Who has power over human beings? God.
Hashem, yeah.
God has power over human beings. We are all obligated to him. The person who was presented in Mishnahs 1 through 5 as being powerful, as having power and control, is presented in Mishnahs 7 through 10 as being obligated, beholden, okay, under somebody else's control, serving somebody else. Okay? And now what does Mishnah 6 do? The bridging Mishnah. It takes the notion of acquisition and translates it into the language of obligation. And says, what does it mean that I acquire something? When I acquire something, what it really means is that other human beings are obliged to recognize my control over that item. What acquisition really means is that other human beings have certain obligations to me. Society has an obligation towards me. And I also have obligations towards the society, and that's the last Mishnah of the chapter. I have obligations towards the society. The same, I have obligations towards the land. The land is also the venue in which my society is supposed to be living. So mitzvot apply, first of all, within the social framework of a family, then within a land, and then within a society. Mitzvot are not just my obligations towards God. Mitzvot are also the glue that binds society together. But something else binds society together, acquisitions. Societies need to recognize who has control over what. If societies don't do that, society will break down. Right? And so we have to we have to regulate acquisitions. We regulate acquisitions, we regulate obligations, and the bridging Mishnah says, acquisitions and obligations look like they're opposite terms, but they aren't really. They really complement one another. Every acquisition really imposes upon me certain obligations. And it certainly imposes upon the society obligations towards me. And every obligation, what does the Mishnah tell us? When you perform your obligations, what does it do? It enables you to acquire the land. Look what just happened. How do I really acquire things? By performing my obligations. That's when acquisitions become real. Because if I don't perform my obligations, I won't stay on the land. God will not enable me to inherit the land. If acquisition of land in the first part of the chapter meant, if acquisition of land meant kesef, shtar, chazakai, take control over it, acquisition of land at the end of the chapter now means when I perform my obligations towards the society and towards the land, then God will grant me ownership of the land. It will really become mine. Now, and let's conclude with this. What does all of this have to? Why is this the introduction to Masechet Kiddushin? Well, we started off by saying the woman is quote unquote acquired. But then the Mishnah takes us through a very profound study of what acquisition really means. Acquisition, outside of the fact that there are different levels of acquisition, and it doesn't always mean property. Sometimes it means some kind of interpersonal relationship with a hierarchy built in. Okay? But the Mishnah goes a step beyond that and tells us acquisition is really not separable from obligation. For human beings, acquisition and obligation have to work together. The bridging Mishnah teaches that. And there are many other connections between the two parts of the chapter that teach us that as well. Let's take the term chazakah. In the first part of the chapter, chazakah meant to seize a piece of property, physically to seize it. That's how I control it. That's how it becomes mine. How is that term used at the end of the chapter? To seize, three values: Torah study, carrying out my obligations to the society by being gainfully employed. I seize that. I seize these values. I seize these obligations. So the words take on new meanings as I go through the chapter, but only by stitching together these two sections. And one of the main tools for doing that is the bridging Mishnah. That's our segue. That's the title of today's class. And now let's just return to two of the previous points I promised to deal with. Amachzik bishloshtan. The number 3 appeared at the beginning of the chapter and recurs at the end. That's another literary technique that you will learn about in upcoming classes. Okay, it's called an inclusio, okay, or an envelope structure. It has other names. Okay, it frames the chapter, and it also relates the acquisition to the obligation, and particularly the acquisition of a wife to the ability to carry out your obligations in the society, and thereby gain a real permanent hold in the land. Because actually, when you marry a woman, okay, it looks on the surface like you're acquiring her, but what you're really doing is you are creating the family structure and the nucleus for the societal structure that's described in the second half of the chapter. So the chapter doesn't want to only tell you what are the laws of Kiddushin. The chapter wants to tell you about the acquisition of Kiddushin and then immediately give you a whole lengthy description of the laws of acquisition and how they are interwoven with the laws of obligation, obligatory commandments, to show you how, when you marry a woman, your acquisition actually is the first step towards your obligation. Okay, and what you are taking as something that is, as it were, yours, is really the most important building block towards building a family.
Mhm.
Okay, though that's the framework of the commandments in Mishnah 7, which is the nucleus for the society of Mishnah 9 and 10. And it all starts with Aisha Niknet. By acquiring the woman, so to speak, okay, you are entering into this whole network of obligations, okay, that makes society possible. Okay, we'll close with that. And I hope to see you all next week, as was mentioned. Rabbanit Adina will be teaching you next 2 weeks, actually. Okay, and Bezrat Hashem, we will meet again in 3 weeks' time.
Rabbi Walfish, is it okay if I just asked a few questions in the chat and
Sure.
also let a few
Please.
people ask questions? Do we have a few minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So one question that I think you wanted me to remind you of, and I don't know if this is still applicable, but what is the significance of the fact that chapter 1 starts with women being acted upon and chapter 2 starts with men acting upon?
Okay, so chapter 1 opened with the woman being acted upon, and then took very serious steps to sort of mitigate that, or to put it into a framework, okay, that makes it more clearly understood. Okay, the woman is acted upon, she's passive, she is quote unquote acquired, but at the same time, once the family is created, she already in chapter 1, she becomes an actor. She also has mitzvot she does. There are mitzvot she doesn't do, but there are also mitzvot she does. And she's an integral part of the mitzvah framework that's described in the second part of the chapter. So the first part of the first chapter is already sort of balanced that passivity of Mishnah 1. The second part of the chapter takes further steps towards making Kiddushin something that is reciprocal. And if you look at chapter 2, the reciprocity of the marital relationship is really very much emphasized. Okay, and what's emphasized in that chapter is much less the social aspect of the marriage and much more the interpersonal relationship of the marriage. Okay, so that's number okay, so that's my answer to that question. I see a question here.
There's
about,
one more
Derech
question.
Eretz.
Yeah, let me ask a question about
Okay, I'd
Derech
like to
Eretz,
relate
and
to
then
the
we'll
question
have
here about Derech Eretz.
Jennifer.
Now,
and
Derech
then
Eretz
Sarah.
in chapter 1 is referring almost definitely to gainful employment, contributing to the workforce, contributing to the societal effort. Right? That's what Derech Eretz means there. Is the fact that it also can be used euphemistically for sexual intercourse. Is that relevant? Well, we saw how Mishnah 1 and Mishnah 3, Aisha nikneit bishlosha drachim. Woman is, it's the only place where that word appears in the rest of the chapter. She's acquired in 3 ways. Derech in that Mishnah and in the last Mishnah might be a way of saying, yes, when man and woman have conjugal relations, then that is creating an acquisition on the one hand, but it's also the building block of the society of the last Mishnah on the other hand. So yes, I think I think the use of that term is very significant. Okay, other, yes.
Jennifer.
Oh, let me first defer to Sarah because she knows so much more. Then I'll follow Sarah.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to say that the symphony, classical music, is built on the same principle, including the segue part, which is called modulatia.
Yes.
Oh, very
So
good. Thank you. Okay, and yes,
this is number one.
the only literature I was able to find on segues, I wasn't able to find any literature about the use of segues in literature, or I found very sparse literature on the use of it in literature. I found much more extensive literature on the use of segues in music. So yes, I think there's a close relationship between musical techniques and literary techniques.
Yeah, and I wanted also to add, there is the midrash עם רבי עקיבא, אם משה רבינו היה שומע את הדרשות של רבי עקיבא, הוא היה מתפעל. כן, you know this one, the story?
Yes, absolutely.
כן, אני חושבת שאם יהודה הנשיא would hear what you did, he would be admiring you.
I think Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had a pretty good idea of what he was doing. I don't think this happened by accident. Okay, I have to conclude now. So thank you all.
Jennifer, did you get your?
I don't want to possess Rabbi Walfish's time, so let you go. I can save it.
Okay.
You can also email me. I'll be happy to answer the question by email.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for learning with us today. And thank you, Rabbi Walfish, for another interesting class. I know we're not going to see you next week, but we'll probably see you the following week. We'll see. We will be together next week with Rabbanit Sternberg. As a reminder, we still have about a dozen of classes coming up in Fall Zman, including writing and translation workshops, Talmud Shiurim, starting this Thursday night. We have another private class on Mishnah skills starting next week, lectures on slavery and Jewish thought, economic inequality, prayer, haftarah, and more. You can learn about these offerings and try our new easy registration form at 5783.drisha.org. Always remember that if tuition might be challenging for you, financial aid is also available. And again, thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Rabbi Walfish, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone here next week. Thank you.
Abby, let me just say wait, one sec. Sarah, you know what I thought you maybe also
Jennifer,
you gotta go. Bye.
I'm sorry, we do need to end now, but
See you.
we will continue next time.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye-bye.